level increased, regional alleviated some of the effects of the pandemic or pandemic-induced lockdowns. The following are key observations on the current macroeconomic picture. First, recovery is underway with robust domestic demand driving the country's growth momentum. Second, on the demand side, consumption accounts for 85% of the 70.8% growth recorded in the first semester of 2022. On the supply side, the services sector contributed nearly 2/3 of the expansion. Further, we expect that improvement in mobility, the promising return of domestic and foreign tourism, strengthened investment sentiments, and the steady inflow of remittances will buoy the economy despite external headwinds. Thus, the country's domestic activity can serve as a strong anchor for the economy, at least in the near term. The following are the major socioeconomic targets of the Marcos administration, which the President has already announced in his State of the Nation address. No doubt, these targets are ambitious. They are not, however, impossible to reach, even with the challenges we face today. The economic team is well aware of our economy's domestic and external risks. These include factors that could disrupt our food supply, including elevated commodity and input prices aggravated by geopolitical and trade tensions, the spread of infectious animal diseases, inclement weather, and issues in the global value chains. The slowdown of major trading partners and the emergence of new public health concerns may also result in weaker demand for goods and services worldwide. The tighter fiscal space and limited absorptive capacity of implementing agencies may also result in challenges in assisting vulnerable population segments. Right policies or priorities in mind and the correct policies moving forward, the economy can be steered through these turbulent waters and back onto its high growth trajectory. The plans and programs of the Marcos administration are framed by its 8-point socioeconomic agenda. The agenda identifies priorities and actions for near-term issues, such as arresting inflation and protecting the purchasing power of families while addressing the vulnerabilities from the socioeconomic scarring inflicted by the pandemic. This will be complemented by policies and initiatives that ensure sound macroeconomic fundamentals and government processes. It also includes strategies to address the medium-term constraints that hinder inclusive growth, the expansion of economic opportunities, and quality improvement generation. In particular, the government seeks to address the long-standing constraints in basic infrastructure such as energy, transportation, logistics, telecommunications, and water. In addition, the agenda will prioritize improving the ease of doing business, ensuring a level playing field, and upholding public order, safety, peace, and security, mindful that these factors underpin a dynamic and resilient economy. This for the medium term, we will be able to create more jobs, higher quality jobs, and green jobs for Filipinos, which is a key strategy for poverty reduction, or rapid poverty reduction. Shall serve as the strategic framework of the 2023 to 2028 Philippine Development Plan, or PDP. Through the PDP, we will flesh out the priorities by identifying key development and sectoral issues, laying out our strategies, programs, policies, and proposing legislative outputs that will contribute to the achievement of the plan's targets. The NEDA commits to submit the PDP by year-end. Let me conclude by saying that there is no compelling reason to believe that our country cannot reach the goals we have set for ourselves. With this in mind, we can take the necessary steps to transform our economy into one that is prosperous, inclusive, and resilient. Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Secretary
Madam Chair,
Malisacan.
Madam Chair.
The chair now recognizes DOF Secretary Benjamin Diokno for his opening statement.
Speaker of Ferdinand Martin Romualdez, Committee on Appropriations Chairman Zaldico, Senior Vice Chairman Stella Kimbo, other honorable representatives present here today, magandang umaga po. First of all, I would like to thank the House of Representatives for passing game-changing economic reforms during the 18th Congress. The tax reform laws you have enacted have helped transform the Philippines into one of the fastest growing economies in the region. Along with other economic liberalization measures, these have allowed us to reinforce our strong macroeconomic fundamentals, weather the harsh effects of the pandemic, and chart a clear path to recovery and sustained growth. My presentation today covers the current state of the economy, followed by updates on our fiscal performance and borrowing efforts, an overview of our medium-term fiscal program, and the legislative priorities of the Department of Finance. In the second quarter of this year, the economy posted a strong growth of 7.4%. The expansion was broad-based with positive contributions from all three major sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. Our actual growth of 7.8% for the first half of the year sits above our target band of 6.5 to 7.5% in 2022. Now, in order to achieve the lower bound of our forecast growth for 2022, the Philippine economy has to grow by only 5.2% in the second half of the year. Meanwhile, to achieve the upper bound, the economy has to expand by 7.2%. Both targets are very much doable. Investor confidence has continued to soar. Last year, our foreign direct investment inflows hit a record high $10.5 billion. And for the first 5 months of this year, foreign direct investment inflows already reached $4.2 billion, 19% higher than the previous year's level. With more productive investments and the full reopening of the economy, the jobs market continues to improve. The labor force participation rate and the average weekly hours worked were higher in June compared to the previous month. Underemployment was also down, and youth employment was up. Fiscal performance and borrowing efforts. Our revenues are on the rise. From January to July of this year, national government revenues reached 2.04 trillion pesos, posting a double-digit growth of 17% compared to the same period in 2021. This was driven by the double-digit growth of both tax and non-tax revenues. Tax revenues increased by 16% and non-tax revenues by 24%. Our revenue collection is above target. Total revenues for the 7-month period are 6% higher than the DBCC approved program of 1.92 trillion pesos. Our improved collection performance rests on the back of increased economic activity due to the full reopening of the economy, complemented by a more digitalized bureaucracy. With these key enablers in place, we expect our revenue collection to reach our target of 3.3 trillion pesos this year, and this is 10% higher than in 2021 and already surpassing the pre-pandemic level of 3.1 trillion pesos. Meanwhile, the latest fiscal ratios show that we are on track to achieving our revenue and tax effort targets for the year. For the first half of 2022, our revenue effort, which is defined as revenue as percent of GDP, climbed to 16.7% of GDP. That's higher than the full year target of 15.2%. Our tax effort stood at 14.9% in the first half of the year. This is above our full year target of 14.5% and is at par with our pre-pandemic performance. This sends a strong signal that our economy is indeed recovering rapidly. Meanwhile, the total fiscal deficit for the first 7 months of the year reached 761 billion pesos. This is 9% lower than the same period in 2021. Comparing it with our targets for the said period, the actual deficit is 27% lower than what we programmed of 1.04 trillion pesos this year. We expect our year-end deficit to reach 1.65 trillion pesos, equivalent to 7.6% of GDP. This is lower than the 1.67 trillion peso deficit recorded last year, which was equivalent to 8.6% of GDP. We are committed to stabilizing our debt in the medium term. This year, the national government is expected to settle at 62% of GDP. As part of the government's prudent debt management strategy and capital market development efforts, we will draw the majority, or around 75% of our financing from domestic sources. This approach will allow us to remain insulated from foreign exchange volatilities due to ongoing global geopolitical risk. In the first 7 months of 2022, our gross borrowings reached 1.25 trillion pesos. Domestic borrowings make up 909 billion pesos of this total, while the remaining 336 billion pesos was from external sources through global bond offerings and official development assistance. The total actual gross borrowings for January to July is already 56% of the program borrowings, which amounts to 2.21 trillion pesos. This is 13% lower than the 2.55 trillion peso gross financing incurred in 2021. Now let me give you an overview of the medium-term fiscal plan. We are determined to pursue a faster, greener, and more inclusive growth that will benefit all sectors. This goal is guided by the Marcos administration's 8-point socioeconomic agenda. In the near term, the plan will address urgent challenges confronting the Filipino people, particularly the impact of high commodity prices due to inflation and lingering economic scars from the pandemic. Over the medium term, we'll focus on creating more jobs, quality jobs, and green jobs. And all of this will be done through higher investments in smart infrastructure, human capital development, and digitalization. Fiscal discipline underpins these goals. The economic team will exercise this by implementing the country's first ever medium-term fiscal framework, which this House already approved, I understand. This fiscal consolidation program serves as our blueprint to reduce the fiscal deficit, promote fiscal sustainability, and enable robust economic growth. Under the framework, we are targeting a faster economic expansion of 6.5 to 8% of GDP from 2023 to 2028. Analysts consider this projection to be the highest among our regional peers. This growth will be driven by a steady increase in revenue collections over the medium term from 3.63 trillion pesos or 15.3% of GDP in 2023 to 6.59 trillion pesos or 17.6% in 2028. We will achieve this through the continued implementation of tax policy and tax administration reforms bolstered by broad-based economic growth. We will ensure debt sustainability over the medium term. We aim to reduce the deficit starting at 6% of deficit in 2023 down to 3% in 2028. This will be achieved through improved spending efficiency and alignment of budget priorities that are anchored on the administration's socioeconomic priorities. Meanwhile, our debt to GDP is expected to stabilize next year and decline from 2024 onwards until it reaches less than 60% by 2025 and further down to 51.2% by 2028. Moreover, the framework ensures that we remain committed to long-term fiscal sustainability while providing adequate fiscal headroom for infrastructure and human capital investments. These are critical to our goal of achieving upper middle income status by 2024 and reducing our poverty incidence to a single digit or 9% by 2028. The government will also focus on productive spending to stimulate growth. Public infrastructure investments, which have the highest multiplier effects, will be sustained at 5 to 6% of GDP. These efforts will be complemented by our enhanced public-private partnership mechanism, as well as the full implementation of our newly enacted economic liberalization laws. We will also eliminate imprudent spending through the right sizing of government agencies, among other efficiency-enhancing initiatives. Now, let me talk about the legislative priorities of the Department of Finance. The medium-term fiscal framework proposes measures that will improve tax administration, enhance the fairness and efficiency of our tax system, and promote environmental sustainability to address climate change. These measures include the remaining tax reform packages of the previous administration. First is the real property valuation and assessment reform. This aims to promote the development of a just, equitable, and efficient real property valuation system. The bill's urgent enactment will improve the quality of valuation of local governments by making the revisions frequent, transparent, reliable, and attuned to market developments. Next is the passive income and financial intermediary taxation bill. The measure aims to boost our capital market development efforts by simplifying and rationalizing the tax regime for passive income, financial services, and financial transactions. Our tax system must also evolve in pace with the digital economy. To this end, we will pursue the imposition of value-added tax on digital service providers. This aims to level the playing field between traditional and digital businesses. Essentially, the bill clarifies that goods, properties, and services, including those that are digital in nature or rendered electronically, shall be subject to value-added tax. Now, as part of the government's climate mitigation efforts, we are also proposing the imposition of excise tax on single-use plastics. The bill proposes to levy a 20 peso excise tax per kilogram of single-use plastics removed from the place of production or released from the customs house. We're also proposing to rationalize the mining fiscal regime to achieve simplification, fair share, value adding, and good governance. This reform can make our mining policy predictable and ensure the equitable share of government in the utilization of natural resources. To achieve value adding, we seek to impose an export tax on mineral ore to encourage downstream and value-adding processing as well as proper valuation of minerals. For good governance, this measure institutionalizes existing transparency and accountability mechanisms in the extractive industries. We have also lined up a series of reforms that will help local governments attain fiscal sustainability. And these measures seek to regularize the review of LGU income classification thresholds, institutionalize a property insurance scheme for LGU assets, and rationalize local tax rates. Now, the Department of Finance also supports the passage of the Military and Uniformed Personnel Pension Reform Bill. This will create additional fiscal space, Your Honor. The Capital Market Development Bill, the Livestock Development and Competitiveness Bill, and amendments to the Land Bank and the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation charters. In closing, allow me to assure Congress that the economic team's proposed 2023 budget will bolster our country's bid for a strong recovery and accelerated growth. With capable leaders at the helm and the right policy tools, we face the next 6 years with full confidence in our bold socioeconomic agenda. And we look forward to working closely with Congress in pursuing much-needed policies to make the country one of the most dynamic and fastest rising economies in the region. Thank you very much.
Salamat, Secretary Diokno. The Chair now recognizes DBM Secretary, Secretary Amina Pangandaman.
Again, good morning to the members of the committee. I am presenting today the proposed national budget for fiscal year 2023. We are one with the President in moving the country forward through united efforts for economic transformation. Our economic transformation will be propelled by our programs to empower the Filipino, ensure food security, and build better more. Finally, our agenda for prosperity is one that ensures inclusivity, that no Filipino will be left behind, and sustainability, that our economic progress is mindful of climate change and sustainable development goals. Hence, the theme Agenda for Prosperity, Economic Transformation Towards Inclusivity and Sustainability. The 5.268 trillion pesos proposed national budget was crafted based on and in support of the administration's medium-term fiscal strategy. This budget will set us on the path to attain the following headline goals of this administration: bring down the deficit to 3% of GDP by 2028, less than 60% of NG debt to GDP ratio by 2025, and 9% or single-digit poverty rate by 2028. The proposed national budget is classified into 4 main pillars: strengthen the purchasing power of Filipinos, reduce vulnerability and mitigate the scarring from the COVID-19 pandemic, enhance bureaucratic efficiency, and provide support to local governments. Overall, the budget is consistent with the priorities outlined by the President during his State of the Nation address. This budget is a springboard for the economy's full-speed recovery and meaningful structural reform. In the interest of time, Your Honor, I will skip the MTFF because it was previously discussed by SOF and the same was already adopted by the House of Representatives. Year 2023 proposed budget. The DBM received a total of 8.66 trillion worth of agency budget proposals for 2023. DBM spent the past few months evaluating them to accommodate the priority programs of the national government, considering the DBCC approved expenditure ceiling of 5.268 trillion. The proposed budget is 4.9% higher than this year's budget and is equivalent to 22.2% of the GDP. On budget aggregates and dimensions, personal services expenditure will have the largest share of the proposed budget at 31%, or 1.631 trillion. This is 16.1% larger when compared to this year's GAA level on account of the implementation of the fourth and last tranche of the Salary Standardization Law 5 next year, pension requirements, creation and filling up of positions, and allocation for the implementation of the national government right-sizing program. Capital outlays will get the second largest share at almost 18.6%, equivalent to 980.3 billion, and expanding by 0.3% year-on-year for various infrastructure programs of the national government, such as road and transport infrastructures. Allocations to local government units, or LGUs, will amount to 962.2 billion, representing an 18.3% of the proposed budget next year. However, this decreased by 11.3% from this year's level, largely due to the lower national tax allotment for 2023, with the lower actual 2020 revenue collections of the national government amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Meanwhile, MOE, or the maintenance and other operating expenses, will total to 873.2 billion, or 16.6% of the proposed budget next year. This will mainly fund the implementation of various education, health, and social protection programs of the national government, as well as the operations of line agencies and departments. The support to government-owned and controlled corporations, composed of subsidy and equity, will reach to 195.8 billion, or 3.7% of the proposed budget. This will grow by 8.4%, owing mainly to the higher subsidy requirements of the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, the National Food Authority, and the National Irrigation Administration. Meanwhile, debt burden will be provided with 611 billion, or 11.6% of the proposed budget. This consists of the 28.7 billion net lending assistance to GOCCs, 582.3 billion interest payments. Tax expenditures will be allocated with 14.5 billion, the same level as this year. By recipient unit, the national government agencies will capture 66.4% of the budget, equivalent to 3.499 trillion. This will fund the operations and implementation of various programs and projects of the line agencies. The LGUs will get 18.3% of the proposed budget with 962.2 billion, composed largely of the 820.3 billion NTA and the 64.8 billion Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao Block Grant. Meanwhile, GOCCs will be allocated with 195.8 billion, or 3.7% of the proposed budget. A total of 611 billion will be set aside for the payment of the government creditors, which is 11.6% of the proposed budget. In terms of the sectoral breakdown, the biggest allocation will be provided to social services sector, amounting to 2.071 trillion, or 39.3% of the 5.268 trillion expenditure program. This is followed by economic services sector, which will receive 1.528 trillion. As in previous years, and consistent with the current administration's goal to reduce poverty, usher in economic transformation, and accelerate economic recovery, these two sectors remain to be the government's top priorities. Meanwhile, the general public services sector will be allocated with 807.2 billion, or 15.3%, and defense with 250.7 billion, or 4.8%. 0.268 trillion proposed budget, 3.011 trillion, or 51.7%, will be directly allocated to the regions. In terms of regionalized budget, NCR will get 989.8 billion, or 18.8%. For major island group, Luzon will receive 954.5 billion, or 18.1%. Visayas with 437.6 billion, 8.3%, and Mindanao with 628.7 billion, or 11.9%. The remaining 42.9%, or 2.257 trillion, will go to the non-regionalized budget. This is composed of the nationwide and central office allocations amounting to 1.869 trillion and 388.7 billion respectively. Departments rank based on their percentage increase vis-a-vis the fiscal year 2022 General Appropriations Act. Again, except for the education sector, the budget for these departments is net of their personal services requirements. As you can see, the highest budget increase went to the transportation with 147.7% increase and to agriculture with 42.7% increase. For DPWH, while there are substantial increases for its routine maintenance of national roads and bridges, for feasibility study, project development, preliminary and detailed engineering, payment of right-of-way, and foreign-assisted projects, these were tempered by lower allocation for asset preservation program from non-recurring capital outlay projects and lower convergence and special support program due to the devolution of some project based on the DPWH Devolution Transition Plan. Now, let me highlight the key features of the next year's proposed budget. The fiscal year 2023 proposed budget is tailor-fit according to the 8-point socioeconomic agenda, which outlines strategies intended to address the immediate issues of inflation, socioeconomic scarring, and low income. Now, let me talk about the pillars of the proposed budget. The first pillar aims to strengthen the purchasing power of the Filipinos, considering the continuing inflationary pressures from both global and domestic sources. The fiscal year 2023 national budget includes programs that will ensure the affordability and accessibility of basic goods and services. To ensure food security, the Department of Agriculture's banner programs will receive a larger share in 2023 compared to its current budget. In particular, the provision for the National Rice Program almost doubled at 30.55 billion from 15.77 billion. The increase is largely due to the 19.8 billion budget for the expansion of the fertilizer support to make fertilizers more accessible to rice farmers to prevent production losses. This will be complemented by the 10 billion Rice Competitiveness Enhancement Fund, or the RCEF, half of which will be dedicated to driving farm mechanization pursuant to RA 11203, or the Rice Liberalization Act, to improve the competitiveness of local rice farmers and increase their income. The production of other commodities such as corn, livestock, fisheries, and high-value crops will also be supported with higher budget next year, as shown in the slide. Meanwhile, research and development in agriculture, aquatic, and natural resources will be strengthened with the 1.23 billion allocation for the DOST's National AENR Sector R&D program, which includes facility development and capacity building along which research funding for marine development, genomics, animal and plant diseases, and innovative horticulture, among others. In addition, investment shall be made on support services like irrigation, as well as construction and rehabilitation and improvement of fish ports in strategic areas for the efficient handling, marketing, and distribution of fishery products. Further, crop insurance, credit services, and market development services shall also be provided. The strategy for food security also considers emergency response for the buffer stocking of the National Food Authority. To alleviate poverty among the marginalized sectors shall also be prioritized through Special Area for Agricultural Development or SAAD project, which involves production and livelihood interventions and marketing assistance and enterprise development. Through the program, a total of 30 priority provinces with high poverty incidence rate among families have been given assistance in both agriculture and fisheries. Starting fiscal year 2023, the continuation of the program shall help additional farmer beneficiaries across 612 municipalities categorized as poor, those who are living below the poverty threshold. Of Agrarian Reform support to parcelization of lands for individual titling or split. We received 6.14 billion to provide individual land titles to 358,258 beneficiaries, while 3.52 billion will be allocated under the Land Tenure Security Program for land acquisition and registration of 27,942 hectares and distribution of 22,101 hectares of private agricultural and government-owned lands. Lastly, the Agrarian Reform Beneficiaries Development and Sustainability Program will be provided with 2.39 billion, including 822 million for capacity building development of agrarian reform beneficiaries for improving farm production and income. Administration's continued push for infrastructure development, the Build Better More program is allocated with a total of 1.20 trillion or 5% of the GDP. This is within the target of 5 to 6% of GDP annual appropriation for infrastructure. The infrastructure program is projected to average at 5.5% of GDP for the next 6 years from 2023 to 2028. Also presented are the top 10 departments receiving bulk of the proposed infrastructure budget, with DPWH and DOTR leading the list. In terms of sub-object, the bulk of the proposed infrastructure budget is intended for road, rail transport, flood control infrastructures. A significant amount is also provided for social infrastructures, covering hospital and health centers, school buildings, housing, and community facilities. Similarly, for the agriculture and environmental sectors, support will be provided for irrigation systems and reforestation programs. For DPWH, some 272.87 billion will be used to finance the provision of an efficient transport and logistics system for goods and services. The DOTR will be provided with 167.12 billion for the establishment of an efficient and reliable mass public transportation system. The rail transport program will receive the chunk of this budget at 113.99 billion to implement the ongoing rail projects such as the north to south commuter railway system with 75.11 billion. In addition, here are the other flagship projects under the DOTR Land Public Transportation Program and their respective budgets, namely EDSA Greenways, Cebu Bus Rapid Transit Project, and the EDSA Busway Project. Transport projects, There are logistics projects meant to lessen the cost of transporting agricultural goods to the increase in road networks and bridges from farms and mills. These include the Farm to Market Roads projects with 13.15 billion, Philippine Rural Development Project with 5.98 billion, the Sugar Industry Development Program with 1 billion, and the Exports and Investment Development Program with 7 billion. Affordable and clean energy, the budget takes into consideration and commitment to reliable and secure mix of energy resources through the DOE's Renewable Energy Development Program, Energy Efficiency and Conservation Program, and the Alternative Fuels and Technologies Program with a total allocation of 476 million. This will be complemented by the continuation of the NEA Sitio Electrification Project, which aims to energize 1,085 sitios in 2023 with a proposed budget of 1.63 billion. Meanwhile, amidst the expected continuing elevated cost of fuel, the budget for the DA's fuel assistance for farmers and fisherfolk will be doubled at 1 billion. 510.45 million of which will be directed towards corn farmers, while remaining 489.55 million will be allocated directly to the fisherfolks. In addition, 2.50 billion is allocated for the DOTR's fuel subsidy program for the transport sector affected by the rising fuel prices. MSME development. The budget strengthens the MSME's linkages to local and international markets through the DTI's 1.53 billion for programs and projects to support MSMEs. For additional financing options for the micro-entrepreneurs, the 2023 proposed budget provides for 1.50 billion to the Pondo sa Pagbabago at Pag-asenso program to cover 40,000 MSME borrowers. Aside from being affordable and cost-efficient, the P3 program also aims to stabilize informal lending and protect micro-entrepreneurs from usurious lenders. The second budget pillar prioritizes protection of individuals, households, and communities from the scarring effects of the pandemic. The government will be providing around 206.5 billion of ayuda under the proposed 2023 budget. This is composed of the cash transfers and other subsidy programs by various agencies. Some 165.4 billion under the Department of Social Welfare and Development will be allocated for the implementation of various social assistance programs enumerated in the succeeding slides. 22.39 billion for MAIP, or the medical assistance to indigent and financially incapacitated patients under the Department of Health. Meanwhile, the TUPAD program of the Department of Labor and Employment will be provided with 15.20 billion for next year. 2.5 billion will be provided to the DOTR for fuel subsidies. And finally, 1 billion will be provided to the Department of Agriculture for the provision of financial subsidy and fuel subsidies to rice and corn farmers. The DSWD's Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, or the 4Ps, is provided with 115.61 billion for education and health grants, as well as rice subsidy to 4.4 million households. This will also cover the provision of the data validation for Listahan 3 for a better beneficiary targeting system. 25.3 billion will be allocated for the social pension for indigent senior citizens to cover roughly 4 million indigent senior citizens. The pension is an additional government assistance in the amount of 500 monthly allowance to augment the daily subsistence and other medical needs of our indigent. The protective services for individual and families in difficult circumstances will get 19.89 billion that will serve as financial assistance to 1,691,869 individuals and families in difficult circumstances through the Protective Services Program. In addition, 4.43 billion will cover the implementation of Sustainable Livelihood Program to support 191,000 household beneficiaries either through micro-enterprise development or employment facilitation. Lastly, we have allocated 3.7 billion for the supplementary feeding program for the provision of hot meals to 1.7 million children enrolled in LGU, managed child development centers, and supervised neighborhood play. Food care and development in the first 1,000 days program will be supported with 158 million. Of the amount, 140 million will cover 15 priority provinces as identified by the Human Development and Poverty Reduction Cabinet Cluster. Meanwhile, 17.8 million of the ECCD F1K program will take care of the LGU support for Tutok Kainan Dietary Supplementation Program of pregnant women and children 0 to 23 months. The Filipino workforce. The Livelihood and Emergency Employment Program of DOLE shall receive a total budget of 18.4 billion, of which tulong panghanap buhay sa ating disadvantaged displaced workers or TUPAD shall receive 14.9 billion. Meanwhile, the DOLE Integrated Livelihood Program will be assisted with 2.5 billion and the Adjustment Measures Program will be given 318 million. And under the newly created Department of Migrant Workers, the OWA Emergency Repatriation Program will be transferred from DOLE and will receive a budget of 10 billion for next year. To support continuing education, digital learning, training, and redeployment measures for upskilling and reskilling of the labor force, the Special Training for Employment Program or STEP, and the Training for Work Scholarship Program TWSP of the TESDA will be allocated with 1.95 billion and 2.64 billion respectively to support a total of 225,000 enrollees. On healthcare. To strengthen our healthcare system, the DOH will be allocated with 23 billion for its Health Facilities Enhancement Program or HFEP. This is to provide access to healthcare services through construction, rehabilitation, and upgrading of health facilities and the purchase of medical equipment. The funds for the 2023 HFEP are focused on the gaps identified based on the updated Philippine Health Facility Development Plan for 2022 to 2040 that supports the implementation of the UHC Act. As part of strengthening the monitoring and surveillance capacity in the health system, 720 million is allocated for the National Surveillance Network that will include transitioning of the COVID-19 surveillance system to regular surveillance activities and redesigning the health statistical systems and programs to better address data and information needs. Prevention and control of communicable diseases is provided with 5.84 billion, which includes, among others, provision for the purchase of Gene Expert cartridges for Gene Expert machines and for procurement of personal protective equipment, PPE, for DOH hospitals, centers for health development, laboratory facilities, and community facilities and isolation units. Lastly, an allocation of 22 billion is provided for the procurement of vaccines under the 2023 program appropriations. The DOH reported that the Philippines has adequate stock of vaccines to cater to the need of the Filipinos. For next year, the department will focus on ramping up vaccination and uptake of boosters for the elderly, and vulnerable populations. To further strengthen the delivery of services in the health sector, some 16.95 billion will be set aside for the National Health Workforce Support System. This will augment, redistribute, and retain health workers in the country and thereby enhance the access of the public, especially those in marginalized areas, to basic health services. To cover the funding requirements for the implementation of RA 11712, the amount of 38.92 billion is provided for the Health Emergency Allowance and COVID-19 Compensation Package for healthcare and non-healthcare workers. In addition, 22.39 billion will be spent for medical assistance to 1.6 million indigent and financially incapacitated patients who are unable to afford and access quality medical care. The National Health Insurance Program will also be provided with 100.2 billion for social health protection. Identification and timely response to outbreaks. The R&D projects for the Virology Institute of the Philippines will be given 419.3 million since the establishment of its structure is already provided for in 2022. Projects of the UP system relating to the Philippine Genome Center will have a budget of 25 million for 2023, which will be spent for the construction and furnishing of Regional Research Center, Phase 4 in UP Visayas, and funding requirements for the new UP Mindanao Infectious Disease Laboratory. An amount of 6.17 billion will also be provided for the operations of the Philippine General Hospital. Opening and in-person education. In light of the challenges brought about by COVID-19, the following programs and projects in education sector will be prioritized. The Universal Access to Quality Tertiary Education Program shall receive a combined amount of 47.4 billion. Education assistance and subsidies will be allocated a total of 54.9 billion, with DepEd receiving 53.2 billion for Education Service Contracting for JHS 12.5 billion, Senior High School Voucher Program with 39.3 billion, and the Joint Delivery Voucher for SHS TVL Specialization with 1.4 billion. CHED will get a budgetary allocation of 1.5 billion for its Student Financial Assistance Program, or STUFAP, while TESDA will receive 200 million for its Private Education Student Financial Assistance, or PESFA program. The DepEd's Basic Education Facilities Program, or BEF, will also be given with 9.8 billion. This includes the construction of 2,379 classrooms and TechVoc laboratories, and repair and rehabilitation of 2,358 classrooms. Option, development, reproduction, and delivery of learning resources will also be allocated with 19.4 billion. The DepEd Computerization Program with 8.9 billion, the School-Based Feeding Program with 5.7 billion, and the Alternative Learning System is supported with 562 million. Students in STEM will continue to be supported by the government with a budget of 7.06 billion. This is for the 55,426 undergraduate, master's, and doctorate scholars of the Science Education Institute, and 376.80 million for the 10,513 high school and senior high school students of the Philippine Science High School System. To improve implementation of online and blended learning, the free Wi-Fi connectivity project of the DICT shall be continued for public spaces and state universities with 2.45 billion and 5.70 million respectively. The government internship program will be allocated with a budget of 708 million. On the other hand, the special program for employment of students will receive a budget of 585 million, and Jumpstart Philippines program will receive 43 million. To invigorate the tourism industry and promote the Filipino brand, 3.30 billion is allocated to the Department of Tourism, the bulk of which is for the branding campaign program. This will be supported by the 1.17 billion allocation for the Tourism Promotions Board for its international and domestic promotions campaign. Marketing the Filipino brand will be futile if the country is unable to take steps against climate change. As such, mobilizing resources that enhance resilience and promote low-carbon development is a key agenda of the government. In pursuit of this, the budget for climate change mitigation will reach to 453.11 billion in 2023, or equivalent to 8.6% of the total proposed budget. This is significantly higher by 56.4% than this year's allocation of 289.73 billion or 5.8% of the budget. The results of the climate change expenditure tagging show that water sufficiency projects have been prioritized with 264.89 billion, while funding for the sustainable energy and food security remains substantial at 131.5 billion and 40.78 billion respectively. Change mitigation and adaptation programs. The following programs have been tagged as climate change expenditures: DPWH Flood Management Program, the National Greening Program under the DNR, Protected Areas Development and Management Program, and the Management of Coastal Marine Resources Areas, all under the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Hence, bureaucratic efficiency, and in support of the administration's trust for a lean, efficient, and responsive government workforce, the fiscal year 2023 proposed national budget will facilitate the transformation and digitalization of the government to streamline the bureaucracy. Through this end, the government will pursue investments in information and communications technology in order to transform and digitalize government processes, records, databases through e-governance. A total of 12.47 billion of the budget will be provided for ICT and digitalization programs and projects of the government. The improvement of revenue collection through digitalization will also be a priority, as the DOF and its attached agencies, BIR and BOC, will receive 3.56 billion, equivalent to 28.6% of the total ICT proposed budget for their digital transformation programs. The DICT will receive 4.72 billion for its ICT systems and infrastructure development, management, and advisory program, which shall include funding for the implementation of the National Government Data Center Infrastructure and the National Government Portal to connect government departments and improve its accessibility, while the National Broadband Plan of 1.50 billion will improve overall internet speed and affordability. Of the Philippine Identification System, or PhilSys, is allotted with 2.06 billion, aimed to provide the identification cards of 92 million Filipinos by mid-2023. Likewise, the DTI's program on the development, facilitation, and promotion of exports and investments and the registration and supervision of investment projects will be provided with 0.77 billion and 0.12 billion respectively. ARTA, on the other hand, will be supported with 149 million for the strengthened implementation of the Ease of Doing Business and Efficient Government Service Delivery Act. Further, the PSA targets to deliver 30 million physical IDs and 20 million virtual IDs by end of 2022. The last pillar will be support to local governments. We'll strengthen the national government's coordination with LGUs while simultaneously capacitating and empowering them to autonomously deliver essential services to their constituents. Under the 2023 national budget, 28.8 billion is included in the Local Government Support Fund, or LGSF. This is around 10.91 billion higher than the 7.97 billion in 2022. And it's broken down as follows. 10 billion will be provided to the support to Barangay Development Program for the implementation of identified support programs of the NTF-LCAP for the cleared and threatened barangays, particularly to address the root cause of insurgency and other armed conflicts. 13.88 billion will be provided to the Growth Equity Fund as financial assistance to the identified poor, disadvantaged, and lagging LGUs pursuant to EO 138-2021 on full devolution to LGUs. Likewise, 5 billion of financial assistance will be provided to all level LGUs except for LGUs under BARM. However, focus will now be the following: implementation of agriculture-related programs and projects, information and communications technology systems and infrastructure development, construction, maintenance, and rehabilitation of green open spaces, infrastructure for active mobility, elevated or at-grade pedestrian footpaths and walkways, and implementation of programs, projects, and activities for disaster response, rehabilitation, and recovery. 28.8 billion LGSF is on top of the 820.2 billion national tax allotment that LGUs will receive for 2023. The 820.27 billion NTA accounts for the just share of LGUs from national tax collections based on the certifications issued by BIR, BOC, and the BTR. That said, together with our partners from Congress, we hope to usher in prosperity through economic transformation towards inclusivity and sustainability. Maraming salamat po.
Salamat, Secretary Pangandaman. So at this point, we proceed to interpellation. And in the interest of time, the Chair will no longer ask questions. Nagpapasalamat din po ako sa napakahusay, napakasipag na technical staff ng DBCC who gave us an advanced informal briefing. So, as part of a long-standing and cherished tradition of the House of Representatives, we accord preferential treatment to the minority members of the House and shall be followed by the majority members in an alternating manner. So at this point, the Chair recognizes from the minority our minority leader, Honorable Marcelino Libanan of the 4Ps Party List.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, the Senior Deputy Majority Leader, Honorable Kimbo, Mr. Speaker, Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, my esteemed colleagues, honorable members of the Development Budget Coordinating Committee. Before I ask our resource speakers, let me be allowed to deliver my opening statement. What we are doing now is in accordance with the mandate of the Constitution, Article 7, Section 22, of which states, the President shall submit to Congress within 30 days from the opening of every regular session as basis of the General Appropriations Bill, a budget of expenditures and sources of financing, including receipts from existing proposed revenue measures. Article 6, Section 24 of the same Constitution further provides that all appropriation bills shall originate exclusively in the House of Representatives. The submission by Secretary Amina Pangandaman of the NEP last August 22 triggered the interaction between two of the three departments of the national government under the Constitution. The Executive Department, personified by the President, and Congress, consisting of the Senate and the House of Representatives, often called the political branches. The third, of course, is the Judicial Department, which is the Supreme Court and the lower courts provided for in Article 8 of the Constitution. Operating under a system of checks and balances, each of these departments is said to be independent, co-equal, but in certain ways serves as a gatekeeper from the abuse of one against another or others. In a specific sense, the NEP, as I see it, is a powerful device granted by the Constitution to the Legislative Department, no less than this House, to courageously confront the challenge and accomplish the task to check and thwart possible abuse by the two other departments. Mr. Speaker, lest the nation speculates on where the minority in this People's House stands in regard to the NEP, we promise you that we shall perform our duty responsibly. We shall be keeping in mind that we have a duty to our constituencies, a responsibility to the House, and by constitutional design, a major role in the workings of a functioning democracy. We therefore pledge to responsibly discharge our role as the democratic counterweight in the legislative process and to be vigilant in the defense of the minorities' rights. Thank you, Madam Chairperson and Mr. Speaker.
Salamat. We now proceed to the independent minority. Honorable Edsel Lagman, you're now recognized. Oh,
Thank you.
Honorable Edsel Lagman.
My first question, series of questions would be to the DBM Secretary.
Our apologies for that.
I'm sorry.
We return to...
I was already called, but I understand the minority leader has still pending statements.
Honorable Lagman, we return to the Honorable Libanan for his question. You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. 2023 NEP, 1.601 trillion has been earmarked for debt servicing, of which 582.32 billion is allocated for interest payments. This is an increase of 13.2% from the fiscal year 2022 budget. In the news article, Ibon Foundation Executive Director Sony Africa stated that this is the most the government has ever paid for debt service. Ibon further opines that this huge allocation is counterproductive, as a portion of this amount may be spent domestically for urgent government programs such as Ayuda, education, health, MSME, and other government programs. Inflation will not ease anytime soon due to the continuing global crisis such as COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia conflict. As inflation continues, the cash grants that the government is extending to the beneficiaries may no longer be sufficient to aid them. Is it possible to reapportion this allocation to other government programs and projects such as social protection programs like the 4Ps and utilize the fund to increase the cash grants being given to our 4Ps beneficiaries? Can the Secretary of Budget please answer this if it is possible?
Secretary Pangandaman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Minority Leader. The debt servicing amount is actually our responsibility. So it's automatically appropriated, and the budget is actually anchored with our medium-term fiscal framework as adopted by the House of Representatives. It is because we want to be consistent on the objectives that 60% of debt to GDP ratio will go down by 2025. Debt burden with that is provided with 611 billion or 11.6% of the proposed budget.
Can we possibly increase the assistance given to the 4Ps beneficiaries?
Man?
The budget that we have appropriated for the 4Ps beneficiaries is within the fiscal space that was provided to us, and again po, we leave it to the wisdom of the Congress if they wish to increase the budget of 4Ps beneficiaries.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Bolibanan.
That would be all, Madam Chair.
Thank you. At this point, we now proceed to the independent minority. The chair now recognizes again Honorable Edsel Lagman.
Thank you, Senior Vice Chair. My question will be directed first to the DBM Secretary Plandaman.
Sir.
Madam Chair, can I proceed? Or debt burden constitutes two components. First, the interest payment, including net, and the second is principal amortization. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And we cannot do anything about these payments because under Section 31 of PD 1177, there should be automatic appropriation for both interest payments and principal amortizations. Is that correct?
DBM.
Yes, sir.
Now, what is the magnitude of the principal amortization payment for 2023?
DBM.
Sir, may I please refer the answer to the Bureau of Treasury?
You're recognized.
The answer,
20.
I think it's 1 trillion
1 trillion.
019 billion
Yes, sir.
634. Is that correct?
That's right, Your
That's
Honor.
right. Now, in the presentation of DPL, 611 billion or 11% of the proposed budget. Is composed of interest payment and net lending. Is that correct?
DOF.
Presentation only gives us a part of the universe because this would not include the totality of what the government is going to pay as debt service in 2023, because the totality is not limited to the interest payment and net lending, but also principal amortization. And I reckon the total would be in the vicinity of 1.6 trillion. Is that correct?
The total debt service, Your Honor, it would be 1.6 trillion. But what's only provided in the budget would be the interest payments of 582 billion, because the 1 trillion that represents the amortization payments are already covered by previous appropriations, because this is just financing the earlier expenditures that have been of which the funding came from obligations, meaning loans, our bond issuances. So there's no need anymore to be able to put it under the budget.
We know that because what is in the proposed budget is only the interest payments as well as nets, and the principal amortization would be the so-called off budget. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's below the line, Your Honor, as we term it.
But in order to present to the public what this government is going to pay in totality for debt service or debt burden, we should be able to tell the public both the interest payments and the principal amortization for the coming year. Is that correct?
DOF.
I think, Your Honor, it is also being disclosed in terms of the total debt servicing, but what was earlier presented was what is appropriated under the GAA, which is the IT, the interest payments.
So, to a layman, what is the answer to this question? What is the total expenditure of this government to service our debts in 2023?
DOF.
It would be 1.6 trillion,
1.6.
including both principal and
Yes. In
interest
other words, we should show the public the universe, not only a portion of the universe. When of an enormous debt service continue in the following years up to 2028?
with the declining funding that will be needed over the medium term, then we expect that the debt service would also eventually decline. And
I beg your pardon?
there would also be a reduction in terms of our debt service, particularly in terms of the interest payments, because we see that there would already be the downward trend in terms of the interest rates eventually.
How about for the principal amortization?
The principal amortizations over time, it would also decline because we are also going into longer maturities over the medium term.
That is notwithstanding that the government is going to borrow again in order to fund the deficit.
DOF.
Is to be able to lengthen the maturity profile so that every year what would be needed for debt service would be lower because it would be spread over a number of years.
May I answer, Your Honor?
You're recognized, Secretary Diokno.
Yeah, first of all, as explained earlier, our needs for borrowing will decline significantly because I don't think we'll have another pandemic in the near future, number one. Number two, what is really relevant is debt as a percentage of GDP, the size of the economy, right? And that has been declining. And so, in fact, that's why I showed that our debt to GDP ratio will progressively decline. It will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% by the end of 2028. Thank you.
Now, just a follow-up question. Our total projected revenue collection, taxes, non-tax, and others, would be in the vicinity of 3.6 trillion. Is that correct?
DOF.
Projections by 2023 is 3.6 trillion
That is
pesos, Your Honor.
And that would be short to fund the 5.2 trillion proposed national budget. Is that correct?
DOF.
Yes, that will be the proposed expenditures. The projected expenditures is 5.1 trillion, Your Honor, and there will be a deficit of around 1.6 trillion. Yes.
And where do we source the amounts to fund the deficit? Is it through new borrowings, among
Yes,
others?
we have to finance it, and the way we will finance it is we will rely heavily on domestic sources, so there will be no foreign exchange risk. In fact, 75% domestic, 25% foreign, Your Honor.
And that would eventually increase our debt stack, and obviously it will also increase our debt burden because of the new borrowing. Is that correct?
Affirmative, Your Honor, but our economy will also increase, Your Honor. So as I said, the relevant thing is our debt in relation to the size of our economy, and that is actually declining.
Honorable Lagman, you have 10 seconds left. Please wind up.
I will reserve my right to ask during the second round, but let me just ask this last question. With the huge size of debt service, of debt burden, how does this restrict the appropriations for basic and social services like education, health, social protection, and job generation?
Actually, Your Honor, our current situation is much, much better than before, right? It's, as I said, it will be in the neighborhood of only 10%. Interest payment as a percent of the budget is approximately 11%, and interest payment as a percent of GDP, interest payment has been constant all along, around 2.4%, Your Honor, very small. And I remember the days, I think we were together when 1/3 of the budget is just interest payments, Your Honor. So we have actually made a lot of progress since those days.
I confirm that. That was shortly after the EDSA People Power Revolution. Now, but you would agree.
Thank you, Honorable Lagman.
Uh,
You may continue your manifestation or questions in the second round. So we now proceed to the majority, but before we do that, the chair wishes to remind all parties to address the chair so that we avoid personal engagement. So for the majority, the chair wishes to recognize Deputy Speaker Isidro Ungab.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Speaker, may I be allowed to propound a few questions, considering that I will be no longer asking questions on the plenary. May I proceed, Madam? May I inquire on a very concerning issue which we are experiencing every time the country is struck by calamities, epidemics, crises, and catastrophes, among others. A few days ago, we just experienced Typhoon Florita. Last year, Typhoon Odette. Last month, an earthquake that shook the north. I am referring to our government assets, which are susceptible to destructions and damages every time we are hit mostly by disasters and strong typhoons. Do we have appropriations for the provision of insurance premiums for government assets against natural and man-made calamities and other catastrophes. I noted that in the 2023 NEP, particularly under the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund, there are no more provisions for the payment of insurance premium of government assets against natural or human-induced calamities, epidemics, crises, and catastrophes as provided for under Republic Act number 656 as amended, or the General Insurance Fund, in order to indemnify or compensate the government for any damage to or loss of its properties due to fire, earthquake, storm, and other casualty. Likewise, no amount is provided in the 2022 GAA for the same purpose. In the previous GAAs, there were appropriations for the payment of insurance premium of government assets. In 2021, the amount of 2 billion pesos was appropriated under the NDRRMF. In 2020, the amount of 2 billion pesos was appropriated also under NDRRMF. In 2019, the amount of 2 billion pesos was appropriated under the Bureau of Treasury. In 2018, the amount of 2 billion was also appropriated under the Bureau of Treasury. In 2017, the amount of 1 billion was appropriated under the NDRRMF. In 2015, the DOH, DPWH, and DOTR were authorized to procure insurance policies for the repair, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and replacement of building and other structures damaged by natural and man-made calamities. The implementation of these provisions were subject to the issuance of guidelines by the DBM, the DEOF, and GSIS. Were these appropriations implemented? How much insurance premiums were remitted? And how much insurance claims have we collected? May we hear the reply from the DBCC, Mr. Chairman?
DOF, you are recognized.
Of our assets. Right now, there's an ongoing what we call a catastrophe bond that was insured through the World Bank facility for catastrophe at risk program. So it will expire in December 2022, and from that bond issuance, we were able to get a payout of about $52 million. So right now, that has already been released to the government of the Philippines. For the coming years, we have earlier proposed the 2 billion insurance premium again. But what we're going through right now, Your Honor, is to be able to have an inventory, and also in terms of the actuarial study in terms of how much premium will be needed to be able to insure all the government assets. So we're starting with the inventory first, and then trying to see what are the risks of these assets so that we'll be able to provide the adequate premium amount for the insurance of these assets, Your Honor.
Mr. Chairman, I have a follow-up question on that later on the second round, because I have a more important question here. May I seek clarification from our friends from the DBCC? If my understanding on the relationship between 2023 cash-based obligation budget of 5.268 trillion and the cash disbursement program of 5.086 trillion is in order, is it correct to assume that not all the 5.268 trillion cash-based obligation budget will be disbursed or paid in 2023, given a normal situation that all the programs and projects in the 2023 NEP are implementation ready? As I look at the fiscal program of the government, the cash disbursement program of 5.086 trillion will accommodate also prior years' obligation or accounts payable of 533 billion, leaving a balance of 4.553 trillion to support the current year's budget of 5.268 trillion. This means that about 715 billion of the 5.268 trillion budget will be obligated during the year 2023 or in the succeeding years. Is this not alarming signal for the prior year's obligation to pile up? This will also eat up a major portion of the current year's cash disbursement program in the succeeding year in 2024. How do you project the cash disbursement. Of course, it depends on the revenue program of the government. However,
Projection ba tayo?
how do you imagine which programs and projects will not be obligated or will be obligated and paid in the succeeding year? For example, which projects will form part of the 715 billion to be paid in 2024? Do you already know which programs and projects will be affected? So, may we hear the response from DBCC on this?
Honorable Ungab, that was your last question. DBM, you're recognized.
Sir, I would like to know the exact question.
I got this from the medium-term fiscal framework that you asked us to support in Congress, but I studied it only after it was approved. And I said, so I will ask this later. So it says here that in 2023, disbursement will be only 5.086. It's 5,085.8 billion. 5,085 trillion in the year 2023. And to look back also with your, actually these are all available in the TBN website. National Budget Memorandum dated June 8, 2022, it is clear that the 2023 cash-based budget program, the total disbursement program for 2023 is 5.085.8 trillion, less prior year's obligation of 533 billion. So these are prior years which are going to pay on 2023. And you will have a cash disbursement of 4.552 trillion. However, there is also a line which says obligation to be paid in the succeeding year of 715.1 billion. What, as a legislator, I would like to know what are these programs and projects for delayed implementation?
Mr. Chair, when we have a budget, it's an actual level comprising of current year's appropriations. And if we are talking of the disbursements, we also consider the past year's obligations which were in effect which will be in effect payable this year. So when we say 5.268, that is the actual level. But the composition would include past year's obligations and current year. In effect, we bounce certain items because we know by its very nature, certain obligations will not be paid within the year. They have gestation periods. They're not due and demandable immediately upon obligation. So, the 750 is an estimate of the amounts that will not be obligated within the year. What will this be? These are projects which are not implementation ready. It may include projects included by the legislature or programs that are centrally managed, which are not identified in the year. As much as possible, we don't want this because under the cash-based system, we want projects only which are implementable. But the reality, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, is that in a given year, there will be projects which will not push through, and there will be projects which, by its very nature, will not actually be implemented.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker Ungab. We now proceed to the minority. The chair now recognizes Honorable Lex Anthony Colada. You may proceed, sir.
Good morning, ma'am. Secretary Ben Tukno, Secretary Medalya, Secretary Balisacan, Secretary Pangandam. Um, somewhere along between global value chain disruptions, fundamentals, and budget aggregates and dimensions. Secretary Pangandaman. 2 points. The 42 billion PPE fiasco. The 2.4 billion laptop controversy. 1122, where the good senator from Ilocos Norte came out with a proposal calling for the abolition of the procurement service of the TBM. I like your aura. You. I realized that you are not just a political accommodation. Your way to the top, you made your bones by working for the likes of Ligarda and Angara, and for the good Secretary Ben Jukno. And that's, I think, is the very reason that you are there. Be that as it may, I'm just curious. I won't talk about the budget. I'm just curious about the mindset of the person who's gonna head that department. Do you subscribe, Secretary Pangandaman, to the same persuasions, to the same motivations which moved the good senator from Ilocos Norte to come out with that proposal?
Secretary Pangandaman.
Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, this is about the proposed abolition of the
Yeah.
PSDBM.
Yes.
First of all, sir,
The answer, just say yes or no.
sir,
Do you subscribe, ma'am,
I,
to the persuasions, the motivations, the mindset, which obviously moved the good senator from Ilocos Norte to call for the abolition of the very office which was created during the incumbency of her father. Do you
Honorable
subscribe to
Colada.
that?
sir, Mr.
Honorable
Chair,
Colada, I just,
if
the
I
chair
may-
wishes to remind you to address the chair.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm sorry. I'm only for 7 days removed from the day I took my office as congressman. I'm
Welcome
sorry,
to
ma'am.
Congress, sir.
very
Secretary
sorry.
Pangandaman.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, if I may, of course, I will defer to the wisdom of the Congress if they wish to really
No, no.
abolish PSDBM. But let me just state that during the time when I was with Secretary Jokno in 2017 to 2019, one of the benefits of the PSDBM is actually the savings that the government incurred during that time, which is worth 18 billion. So I think if we give a chance to PSDBM, and if we clean the process and the system of the procurement in PSDBM, maybe we can go back to its old glory. We appointed someone who is very respectable in the area, which is Attorney Dennis Santiago. So we already have programs on how to fix PSDBM. So if I may po, if you'll be giving us a chance to at least clean PSDBM, we will highly be happy with that.
Ma'am,
Rep. Colada.
ma'am, can I
Yes.
respectfully request the good secretary to make those representations in writing?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair.
I would greatly appreciate if she can submit those presentation in writing at least days ahead of the scheduled debates in the plenary. Madam Chair.
The chair instructs the DBM to submit a written statement on the matter. Rep. Colada.
I'm good with that, ma'am. Can I proceed with the...
Please proceed.
Yeah. Good morning, sir. DOF, BIR, Bureau of Customs. Revenue targets. Sir, we have this, are you familiar with the attrition law? Attrition, have you heard of the lateral attrition law, sir?
Yes, I
Yeah.
have heard of.
To those who are not familiar with the attrition law, it is a scheme, a mechanism wherein it was designed to boost the revenue generating capacity of DOF, right? Sir, I only like to request for a detailed, more or less a detailed performance or activities conducted by the Bureau or by the department for years representing 2010, 2016, meaning pertaining to during the time of President Aquino, and then 2016, 2022.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I will instruct the BIR Commissioner who's here.
Yeah.
She's been with the BIR for 40 years, okay?
Yes, yes.
And I took her in
Yes.
under Mr. Duterte.
Yes, sir.
But she's back. I will ask her to write a report on that.
Madam Chair, same thing. I request that the same be in writing, please. My last question, if you allow me. Secretary Balisacan, I have only one question. No, it's just a query. I think the first quarter of this year, Congress came out with this Public Service Act, right? And I know it just, yeah, right? They
Secretary
came out with the
Balisacan.
Public Service Act, right?
That's correct,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair.
And I understand, I know fully well that you just 3 weeks removed also from taking your oath as Secretary of NEDA,
Balisacan.
right?
Could you say that again, Chair? Sorry.
Have you heard of the Public Service Act, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay. So all I'm asking is that in order for us to appreciate this Public Service Act thing, we need the IRR.
Correct.
Yeah. What is the status or update on the IRR and who's in charge?
Rep.
Right.
Colada, that's your last question.
Yes, yes.
Secretary Balisacan, just an
Yeah.
update on the IRR of the PSA amendments.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, we have already received comments from the various stakeholders, and we are now addressing those comments with a view that toward issuing the IRR by October per schedule, Madam Chair. So by October this year, we expect to publish the IRR of the PSA.
Madam Chair?
Thank you, Rep. Colada. The chair reminds the DBM and the BIR to make the necessary submissions to the Committee on Appropriations.
Thank you, ma'am.
We now move to the majority. The chair recognizes Deputy Majority Leader Wilter Palma. You may proceed, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Madam Chair, I have only two questions. First, we know our budget depends upon the forecasts that we intend to receive, the revenues forecast that we intend to. In the event that there are supervening event will happen within the fiscal year, what would be our approach? We could not meet the forecasted revenues that will flow in. What would be our approach? Yes.
DOF.
Your Honor, the binding constraint really is the size of the deficit, okay? Because if we overperform on the revenue side, then that will result in a lower deficit. Because we cannot increase expenditures because that's what you approve. Okay? We cannot spend more than what Congress has approved. So if we overperform, and it looks like we are overperforming at the moment, that will just simply reduce the deficit, Your Honor.
Sir, what, Madam Chair, sorry.
Rep.
Madam Chair,
Alma.
if I may. In the event that we cannot meet the forecast revenues that will flow in, what would be our approach?
DOF.
Well, I've been in budget for so long, Your Honor. In the past, what they will do is they will withhold the releases. I do not do that anymore. We release because that's what Congress appropriated. So we will simply increase the deficit, Your Honor.
Rep.
As I
Alma.
said, that's the binding constraint, the size of the deficit.
Lastly, Madam Chair, if I may, I'll address this to DBM. The FLR for later release, what would be our in fiscal year 2023? What would be our approach in the FLR status?
Mr. Chair,
DBM.
Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, we want to promote growth in 2023. So the FLR will be, there will be no FLR next year, Mr.
So-
Speaker.
Thank you, thank you. Madam Chair, I still have 3 minutes, and my good friend, Deputy Secretary, Deputy Speaker would like to ask the remaining time, if you will allow, DS Ungab, since I still have 3 minutes and 30 seconds.
If I will be allowed, Madam Chairman?
Rep. Palma, unfortunately, we will not allow the yielding of
Okay.
remaining time. You are free to
Yeah.
have yourself listed in the second round,
Yeah,
Your Honors.
no problem. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And we thank you profusely for your very efficient questioning, Rep. Palma. So we now move back to the minority. Representative Arlene Rosas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maraming salamat. Madam Chair, I will be asking about the infrastructure spending amidst the cuts on social services. Madam Chair, nasa 1.196 trillion or 5% of GDP ang nakalaan para sa infrastruktura sa panukalang 2023 budget. Tama po ba?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, this is 22.7% ng total budget natin. At pinackage po nyo ito ng build, better, more. Kaiba po sa administrasyon ni Duterte na build, build, build. Pero, Madam Chair, dito, hindi namin makita yung more and better. Kasi, halimbawa po, magkano ba ang nakalaan para sa mga bagong classroom? Mapupunuan ba natin yung mga 91,000 classroom shortage na meron tayo? And magkano ba ang nakalaan para sa pabahay o housing para sa infra?
DBM.
Yes, ma'am. I'll just get to the budget for Build Better More for 2023 will amount to 1.2 trillion or 5% of GDP, of which 429 million will go to road networks, 177 million will go to flood control systems, 164 million for the to fund the development fund under the LGUs, 105 billion will go to railways, 74 billion will go to buildings, which includes the school buildings and school building projects of the government. Irrigation system will receive 29.4 billion. Right-of-way projects will receive 28.6 billion. Hospitals and health centers, this is under HFEP, will receive a total of 23.2 billion. There's a separate item for school buildings, which is 13.9 billion. Water supply systems, 5.7 billion. Power supply systems, 3.6 billion. Housing and community facilities, 2.5 billion. Some 1.4 billion for the reforestation projects. These are the major projects under the infrastructure capital outlays under the fiscal year 2023 proposed budget. Mr. Chair, Madam Chair.
Rep Rosas.
Yes, Madam Chair. Pag tinignan niyo po, yung road networks ang pinakamalaki. 419 or sabi niyo nga kanina, is it 429 billion? Kasi ang nakalagay lang sa akin ayon sa BSF ay 419.42 billion. Tapos yung right of way 28.66 billion. Yung health facilities 23.24 billion, skilled school buildings 13.9 billion, and housing 2.5 billion. Madam Chair, yung pondo po na ito, why not aim for more funds for schools and public housing, more funds for the social services, or di kaya cash aid? Mas mararamdaman ito ng mga ordinaryong Pilipino, Madam Chair. Di po itong mga road networks, mas malaki pa nga yung right of way, Madam Chair, para dito sa mga ipinapakita na ito ng BESF, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, we already increased the budget for school buildings programs by 3 billion. However, we need to take into account the absorptive capacity of the departments and agencies in the preparation of budget.
Madam Chair, hindi niya pa sinasagot yung tanong ko kung kaya bang punan yung shortage ng classroom ng budget na ito. And yung, alam niyo naman yung backlog sa housing. Alam po natin yung lahat. And with this budget, kaya ba ito, Madam Chair?
DBM.
Madam Chair, we have, in preparation of the budget, we consider our fiscal space as provided for by the DBCC. And with that, we have a formula to allot or fund each department. And in preparing the budget, as previously said by my colleague here, we take into consideration really the utilization and absorptive capacity of the agencies.
So, Madam
Rep.
Chair,
Rosas.
is it a yes or no?
DBM. Rosas
Madam Chair,
wishes a categorical answer,
Is it a yes or no?
but
The
I
answer
believe
to my question.
Wait,
Suspension for the school buildings and the housing.
Madam Chair, we don't have enough funds to provide for the backlog of the classrooms. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Rep Rosas.
So, Madam Chair, no. Okay. Madam Chair, I need to ask po doon sa bakit kinaltas yung protective services. Malaki yung kaltas doon Madam Chair. Tapos, wala tayong libreng sakay. Tama po ba? Sa service contracting sa DOTR. Bakit
DBM.
po napakalaki ng kaltas natin sa protective services ng DSWD?
Ma'am, for the libreng sakay under the increase in 2022 for the ayuda is an amendment from the Congress, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker.
Rep Rosas.
Okay, Madam Chair, mukhang hindi masagot yung tanong ko. Baka itatanong ko pa ito sa particular sa DSWD. Madam Chair, to my next kaugnay po ito sa NTF-LCAC budget, yung 10 bilyong alokasyon. For the record, Madam Chair, nakapag-submit na ba ng listahan ng project sa NTF-LCAC, yung sa DBM para sa Barangay Development Program?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Madam
Mr.
Chair, wala bang kopya kasi wala rin siya sa NED, Madam
But
Chair.
it's not yet complete.
It is not yet complete.
Yung provision. Some barangays have not yet submitted.
So, Madam Chair, hindi ito mga shovel-ready na mga projects.
DBM.
Madam Chair, we have to consider that these projects are being implemented by barangays. So they do not have the technical knowledge, nor do we expect them to be in a similar situation as municipalities. So that's the reason why certain barangays, especially in the far-flung areas, will not be able to submit these lists because it would require technical specifications. However,
Process.
the barangays have submitted and we have already released a substantial amount of the NTF-LCAP.
Madam
the barangay
Chair,
development project.
saan po yung basis ng 10 billion natin kung hindi naman natin alam kung ano yung mga details nung NTF-LCAP no, na projects dito sa mga barangay development program na ito?
Madam Chair,
DBM?
yes. The 10 billion is an installment in effect because last year we provided 20 million per barangay. We proposed 20 million per barangay for the cleared barangays at least for 1,400 plus, if I'm not mistaken. But as a result of the iterations made by Congress, this was reduced to 4 million per barangay. So the 10 billion that we are proposing would in effect just even it out, but it will not completely provide the 20 million per barangay that was initially estimated as the amount that would be required to keep these barangays at par with those other barangays which had not received any or which are not yet cleared, so to speak.
Madam Chair, why do
process.
we allow this kung hindi naman pala, no, why do we allow the barangay na to implement this kung hindi naman pala sila, hindi pala nila kaya? And now, we are doing it again by putting the 10 billion budget para dito sa NTF-LCAP. I don't understand, Madam Chair.
Rep Rosas, your observations are well noted. You may proceed to your next question.
Yes. Madam Chair, gusto kong masagot ng maayos dito, no? Pahingi din po ako ng listahan kaugnay ng mga naisubmit na sa inyo kasi wala nga siya sa NEP. And supposedly kung nasa NEP siya, nakikita natin kung saang mga barangay, ano-ano ang mga detalye ng mga ito, no? Madam Chair. So, I would like to have a copy of that.
Yes, Madam Chair, we will submit to the committee.
And Madam Chair, in the interest of time, kasi ito pong tanong ko kaugnay dito sa DND and kasi hindi po nilagay sa President's budget message yung elaboration on programs and projects of the DND and NDILG. Kahit po nag-increase, may mga increases sa mga programs and projects ng two agencies na ito. In fact, meron pong 800 million na karagdagang pondo para sa PNP. Meron din pong AFP Modernization Program, 40 billion, na malayo sa 29.05 billion last year, which is a 38% increase. No? Sinadya ba ito na hindi ilagay sa budget message?
Rep Rosas, that is your last question. DBM, you may proceed.
Madam Chair, may i-request lang po akong...
You may be listed in the second round, Rep Rosas.
May I request bago niya sagutin yung Ang details lang po ang kailangan ko for DOF for the preparation of the plenary. May I sa Treasury po, sa Department of Finance, sa Bureau of Treasury, breakdown of the domestic debt program for 2023 by type of debt instrument. May I have that? Thank you, Madam Chair. That's my last request doon. Tapos answer po sa question. Maraming salamat.
Right? DBM?
Ma'am, the details of the respective budgets of the departments are provided for in the NEP and even the BESF. I don't think we would like to have quite a thick President's budget message on that. We can provide you the details of the increases in DILG and DND, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So the Chair reminds the DBM to submit the detailed information, barangay level information on the NTF-LCAC as well as the DOF for the breakdown on the relevant information on that. At this point, We now move back to the majority. The chair now recognizes Representative Salvador Plato. You may proceed, sir.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Good morning po sa ating mga kaibigan sa Executive Department. Ang sabi po ng Pangulo, ng mahal nating Pangulo, sa kanyang suna ay his fiscal policy to bring together the national government's resources so that these are mobilized and utilized in order to gain the maximum benefit and the high multiplier effects for our economy. Doon ako interesado sa keyword na multiplier effects being a new fight. Sigurado po ba tayo na ang budget ng 2023, which is around 5.268 trillion, isa ngang magkakaroon ng multiplier effect sa ating ekonomiya? Di po ba, Madam Chair, dahil po sa pandemya, marami tayong nanatiling problema pa sa supply chain at kakulangan sa produksyon. Thank you.
DBM.
Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, if I may, yes.
Anybody can answer that,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, the multiplier effects of the proposed budget on the economy and also on the various sectors, including the social sectors, are quite evident, Madam Chair, in the way we look at the as reflected the 8-point agenda, where we address there the basic constraints to growth and poverty reduction and investment. And so if we succeed in getting those monies into those, addressing those areas, we should be able to generate more investment, should be able to revive growth, productivity growth in agriculture, should be able to provide more opportunities in our tourism, in our manufacturing, and the multiplier effects from those economic opportunities that will be opened up is the one that are the ones that will generate the sustained and inclusive growth that we described earlier, Madam Chair.
Rep. Plato.
Madam Chair, follow-up question. If we are sure that there are multiplier effects, do we have a measure of these multiplier effects of government expenditures? Nagbabago po ba ang multiplier effect, lalo na po kung may pandemya?
Secretary Balisacan.
We do have estimates of those multiplier effects, particularly on government expenditures, Madam Chair. Our Philippine Statistics Office regularly publish the input-output table of the economy, where we can see all these interconnections of the various sectors of the economy, including the government sector's spending, Madam Chair. And we can share that with the Honorable Member of Congress.
Rep. Plato.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I have another question? Another question, Madam Chair. Dalawang bagay lang po ito is happening in our economy. Yung tinatawag nating higher inflation, which is above the target. At exchange rate depreciation in peso dollar. Will you please enlighten us? Would these movements in these variables be disadvantageous to or affect negatively government's program of expenditures by 2023? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Governor Medalla, you may wish to respond.
Honor, can I ask for a repetition of the question?
Rep. Plato.
Sure that there are multiplier effects. Do we have a measure of these multiplier effects of government expenditures? Nagbabago po ba itong multiplier effects, lalo na po kung may pandemya?
Plato. I believe your question for Governor Medalla had to do with inflation and whether that would impact on
Mad-
the government programs.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, you want to? Well, from our end po in the DBM, when we prepare the budget, we have budget sensitivity of macroeconomic parameters. It's already in the BASF. A peso, for example, for peso to US dollar exchange rate, a peso depreciation will result to an increase in disbursements of 2.4 billion. The same goes for our treasury bill rate, for LIBOR, for inflation rate, and real GDP growth rate and growth rate of imports. It's in the table 8.6 of the BASF. Sir Arce, you want to add something?
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I may.
Madam Chair, yung tinatanong ko po yung enlighten us sa
Replito. Governor
Madam Chair.
Medalla is recognized.
Yeah, so it's a question on inflation.
yeah.
This-
Will
Okay.
you please enlighten us on these things happening now in our economy? This higher inflation, which is above the target, at saka po yung exchange rate depreciation,
Okay.
peso dollar.
Mi-
We would like to know if these movements in these variables be disadvantageous to or affect negatively government's program of expenditures by 2023.
Madam
Governor
Chair,
Medalla.
Madam Chair, very good and at the same time very complicated question, but I'll try to answer it the best of my ability. Obviously, the inflation, as you stated, is very high, especially this year. By the way, if you compare Philippine inflation recent with the record 10 years ago, and you do the same for other countries, the Philippines actually has a much better ratio. In other words, the Philippines is less affected by the inflation compared to other countries. But nonetheless, you're right, it will affect growth because if people are spending more money on transport, fuel, food, they will have less money for other things. So the inflation that comes from abroad clearly will hurt us. But there's very little we can do about it since those prices have totally beyond our control. So the question of whether the inflation will hurt us, the answer is yes. Now, and the question as to what will happen and the things that affect the exchange rate, there are three major factors. The first one is the extent that the Philippine economy is growing faster than our neighbors, then our imports will be growing faster than our exports. So that will exert some pressure on the peso. The second factor is to the extent that we're paying more for the same imports, which I said is 2/3 of the increased demand, that also will weaken the peso. The third one is to the extent that the US Fed is increasing interest rates, then the moving the money to the US becomes more attractive, and that will also affect the peso. Now, to the extent that there's too much depreciation, that is bad for the inflation and the economy, and the central bank raises interest rates, of course, that will also affect the economy. But as I already stated, not enough to prevent us from achieving what was stated in the budget. So now, whether the depreciating peso is good for some sectors and bad for some sectors, the answer is yes. If you're an exporter, or you are a firm that sells domestic products that compete with imports, the weaker peso is good for you. On the other hand, if you're an employee of government, the weaker peso is bad for you because it increases the inflation, and unless you get a salary increase, your purchasing power is lower. So it's a very mixed thing. The weaker peso is good for some sectors and bad for some sectors, but to the extent that it is market determined, it improves the allocation of resources. It tells us, buy less imported goods. It tells exporters, you are now more competitive. Okay, on the other hand, as I already said, it reduces, to the extent that it increases inflation, it reduces the amount of money that people can spend on other things. So it's a mixed bag, but on the whole, it is not going to prevent us from achieving the goals that are stated in the DBCC budget. Of course, there are many other things that can affect growth. Clearly, high import prices are good for the exporters of oil, the exporters of commodities, and bad for us. So, on the other hand, if those prices begin to moderate, as forecasted by the BSP, the picture is a little bit better for us. I hope that is sufficient, Madam Chair.
Thank you for that assurance,
Thank you.
Governor Medalla. Rep Lito.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you po, Governor Vidal. Governor, kayo po ay nasa NEDA when I was already the Regional Director of Southern Tagalog and NCR as the Public Works. Kaya kilala po ko kayo. Thank you po.
At this point,
Thank you, Madam.
our very generous speaker has declared a health break. We will take a 1-hour lunch break. So we will resume at 1:30. And just for your reference, the following are still listed. Rep. Franz Castro for the minority, Rep. Manuel, Rep. Herrera D. And for the majority, Rep. Marco, Rep. Marivico Pilar, Rep. Ordinaire, Rep. Dolph De Venecia, Rep. Joey Salceda, and Rep. Ed Haresco. So see you at 1:30. And of course, Diaz Ralph Recto.